Hi, I'm Karen Rice and welcome to this step-by-step Sunset Over Mountains watercolour tutorial. This tutorial is really to give you, the viewers, an idea of the type of videos that I have in my YouTube channel membership and my Patreon membership. With the membership, you get longer videos, more voiceovers with lots of tips and techniques. If you have any questions about the memberships, please put them in the comments section below. These are my materials. I'm using my black velvet brushes, a size 14, 10, 6 and 2, my twig, my HB pencil, a selection of colours which I'll have in the description below, a couple of palettes which are old palettes. I've got lots of used paint there. I'm going to use that in the demonstration, and my water pot. So, shall we get started? First things first, I'm going to draw the lovely landscaping. I'm going to keep it really simple. I'm using my HB pencil, and the paper I'm using is 300 grams, and not surface paper, and it's by Canson, and it's the heritage paper. I like to use the not surface because it's got a bit of texture, but it's not too rough. As you saw there, I put my framing tape underneath my painting to tilt it so the paint runs down, and it's quite a nice sort of technique. So the first thing I'm adding here is quinacridone gold, and it's to create, if you look at the reference photograph, it's to create that lovely golden light in the sky. Now this is a photograph I took when I was on a break in Killarney in Ireland. And these are the McKillicuddy Reef Mountains, and it's a stunning view, and the sun was going down and I was so taken by the light. I'm using a bit of cerulean here and a touch of purple. I'm painting this sky wet in wet with my large size 14 brush, and as you can see, the paint is running down nicely there, and I'm adding a touch more of the quinacridone gold just towards the sort of horizon there. And as you can see, I've got a little bit, I'm being a bit naughty here. I've got a little bit of sort of, I'm just doing this sort of freely. I want it to be quite loose with this painting. So I've got little bits of residues of paint there, but I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to enjoy it. It's a bit of texture, and I just want to have fun. I want to show you how you can express yourselves in watercolor painting. I've got a little bit of the purple there with a tiny touch of the quinacridone rust, but you could use burnt sienna, and in the description below I will give you alternative colors that you can use in this painting. Now this is all wet on dry now. I only did the sky wet on wet. Everything is wet on dry. So the hedgerow there was the quinacridone gold, and now I'm just using a light green, that's the yellow, with a touch of the cerulean, and now a touch of indigo to make a slightly darker green, wet on dry, and I'm just painting with this large size 14 brush, just getting all this underpainting on, just having fun with it. So what I'm doing now is I'm using my size 10 brush, and I'm using the indigo with some green apatite genuine. It's a Daniel Smith colour, but you can use sap green or even Viridian. And I'm just making a slightly darker green, creamy colour, and I'm painting damp into wet just to create some of the shadows on that grass area in the foreground. And what I love about painting in this way, you can see now the paint sort of running and doing its own thing, and don't interfere with that, let it do its own thing. And now I'm using this creamy paint to put in the hedgerow there, painting damp into wet, so the paint's creamy and the surface is wet. I quite like using this technique. I'm just using a tube with the pointy end at the bottom and scratching out in the grasses area to create thin blades of grass, some textures and details in the foreground. Now I'm using my twig, which I freshly sharpened with my craft knife, and I'm actually scratching into this sort of browny greenish colour here, and it creates these very, very thin trunks and branches, and it's a really nice way of drawing these tree trunks and branches actually. What I would suggest though is this is permanent, so if you're not sure about this, don't do it and just use paint later. You might find it helpful that way, but I quite like working in this way, scratching in and creating some textures. Here's a close-up view here, and I'm really pleased with how this painting is developing. It's got lots of textures. Now, I didn't say this earlier, but I've decided to use some sea salt because I wanted some more texture in the foreground. You don't have to use this, but this actually absorbs the paint and creates lighter areas and lots of yummy textures. And the painting has dried, and look at that lovely effect the salt has created. And I'll give you a close-up of that. Isn't that yummy? What you need to do once it's dry, just brush the salt away. Now I'm mixing up a little bit of violet and a touch of indigo, and I'm painting these mountains now. And it's actually kind of a glaze, because if you look in the reference photograph, they're quite pale because that sun is almost bleaching them. I'm using my size 14 brush, and I'm being very careful not to disturb the watercolour underneath, because you'll muddy your paints then as well and create some backgrounds and horrible marks. So you just glide and glaze your paint along your dry paper, and always collect fresh paint each time. As I'm nearing the right hand side of this painting, as you look at the reference photograph, it is paler, so I've just diluted my brush there, and I'm just gliding and glazing this paler wash to the right hand side, and just sort of really just softening that edge there, and I've let that dry. So I'm mixing up a bit of the quinacridone rust and the green apatite genuine. These are mouthfuls to say these colours, but it makes a lovely sludgy, warm, greeny brown. And I'm painting this wet on dry, and this is kind of the hedges, you know, just in the sort of middle ground there. And I'm using my size 10 brush, and I'm just painting this wet on dry, using the side of the brush to get a little bit of texture, because I want some texture on the top of the hedgerow there. And I'm just sort of putting a little bit of dark. Now this is just indigo, creamy indigo into wet paint, so it's damp into wet, and I'm using the tip of my brush to apply this paint. You get a lovely dark area here. So I'm giving my brush a rinse, and I'm getting a little bit more of the brown and a touch more of the green, and I'm just going to paint a little bit on top of this right hand side, because I had another look at the reference photograph and that side's slightly higher. So I'm just putting this sort of wet into wet, damp into wet, you know, that sort of thing. Just putting this sort of slightly darker tone, rinsing off my brush and just softening here and there just to get a lovely. And what happens now is those mountains in the distance really look further away because they're paler in tone, and this area looks stronger and darker. And I'm just using my sponge, which I've dipped into the water, wrung out all the excess liquid so it's damp, and I'm sponging creamy paint into wet paint, so I'm getting some textures on the top of these hedges or background trees, etc. So I'm just really trying to get lots of texture. So I don't want it to look like the mountains, and that's why I wanted a little bit more detail on top of there. And here I go with my twig again. I just can't resist using it. It just feels so organic, and I'm just sort of creating some little bits of textures here and there. And what happens sometimes, if you can see there, I'll give a little close up there, it does actually lift off the paint a little bit, so it creates a little bit of light. Now you don't have to do this. I do like doing this though. It really does, because there's so much detail and texture there, and it's so easy to do it with the twig. Now I'm mixing up some indigo here because I want to paint the darks for the trees. So I'm painting the trees on the left hand side. I've turned my painting upside down because I really find it easier to paint trees, especially very thin wintry looking trees like this, by sort of starting at the bottom and then pulling them towards me, rather than using my paintbrush and sort of, I almost feel like I'm balancing it doing the other way. I just find this so much easier to do. So why not give that a try? It might make winter trees especially much easier to paint. And I'm using the size 2 brush to get these really small, thin branches and tree trunks. So you start off thicker at the bottom, and then you sort of lift off your brush as you get into the very, very thin branches. And as you can see here, I'm just doing some rapid strokes here just to get all that detail in there. So just to keep it really, really simple. And I would suggest, if you're a little bit worried about doing that, just practice it first. on a rough bit of paper or an old back of an old painting so that you feel a little bit more confident. What I'm doing here is I'm just putting some of that sort of shadowy sort of areas at the top of the trees where there's lots of brush, as it were. So I'm just using a very, very watered down sort of greeny colour, or just sort of mucky colour in my palette, really diluted down, but it gives an impression of the brush at the top of the trees. And I'm doing the same to the right hand trees now. I'm using the size 14 brush. This is wet on dry, and I'm doing it quite rapidly so you get that little bit of texture, and I'm just dropping a little bit of a warmer browny dilute colour in there as well, just to kind of give it a little bit more oomph. And as you can see there on that left hand trees there, it gives it a nice bit of texture. What I'm doing here is I'm just putting in some fence posts. Now it's not in the photograph, but I know as I sat there is sort of some fences in the distance. You can't really see it, but it's a bit of an artistic tool, and it's quite a useful thing. It creates depth in a painting. It's another layer. So it's the indigo, and I've painted it quite dark, and I put some sort of little bits of wire on there as well, and some grasses underneath. I'm using my large brush now just to create a little bit of cast shadow from these fence posts as well, and it kind of grounds them. And I'm using my plastic card now to scratch out on the left hand side to make it look like the light's coming from that direction, and so it creates a little bit more of a 3D fence post. But it looks so effective, and it just gives that little bit more detail. So I'm finishing off these trees on the right hand side. They're a little bit nearer, so I'm giving them a little bit more detail. I'm using the size 2 brush, and I'm using indigo, and it's wet on dry. So I try to keep the tree trunks slightly fatter, and then the branches and the thinner branches much thinner. And I'm just using my sponge now just to give a little bit of texture to the trees, that sort of like some sort of hedges or trees behind, you know, just to create that bit more detail. And I'm putting that as well underneath the fence posts. I love painting landscapes because I love texture and detail and bringing and making things look 3D. And here I'm putting some more grasses around that fence post area. It just brings this forward and pushes the background back by putting these darks and details. It's so effective. I love to have a little spatter, so I'm just using the yellow on its own and spattering so they look like wildflowers. I forgot to use my kitchen towel there to protect my sky, so do remember to do that so you don't want any yellow blobs in your sky. But I'm just spattering nice wet paint, tapping the brush firmly, and just really sort of giving this, it gives it a little bit of sparkle and brings the painting to life. And you know, it stops me from fiddling. It creates sort of a finish that I'm looking for that last bit of detail. I decided to use a little bit of white paint on these fence posts just to bring them forward a little bit because they looked like they were sinking back into the background, making the painting look a little bit flat. So here, look, immediately it lifts them. So don't be afraid to use white paint, but don't start mixing your whites with other colours because you may as well start using gouache. You want to keep it that sort of authentic watercolours if you can. And I couldn't resist. I had a little spatter of white. I forgot to mask out my sky again. So if this happens to you, here's a good little tip for you. I'm just getting some dark paint, something that's left in my palette. I'm using my size 2 brush, and I'm just going to create a few little birds in the sky. It's quite a good thing to do as well because it gives it a little bit of detail. It lifts the painting. It makes you look up. So I painted the one at the very top there a little bit larger, so it gives it a little bit, so that they're the ones that will be nearest to you, and the ones in the distance a touch smaller. So I'm removing my framing tape now to reveal a lovely white border, and it gives me time to assess to see if I need to do anything else to my painting. So take a look at the bottom left hand corner. There's a big fat grassy bit. I've decided to lift that out with a damp piece of tissue and just to push it back to make it fade. And now I'm using some creamy yellowy green paint, and I've just sort of layered that over so it just sort of disguises it. So I'm going to leave it there for now. I really hope you've enjoyed this step-by-step tutorial of these mountains with the sunset sky. And if you'd like to see longer videos just like this one, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about this will be in the description below. And if you have any questions, please put them in the comments section and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.